Before we begin, if you're fascinated by the hidden world of Cold War espionage, the real stories behind Russian intelligence operations, and the human cost of living double lives, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you meticulously researched Cold War cases every week, uncovering the documented truth behind operations that destroyed families and changed the course of history. Now, let's talk about a suburban house in New Jersey that concealed one of the most sophisticated Russian spy networks ever discovered on American soil. On the afternoon of June 27, 2010, at approximately 3:45 p.m., FBI Special Agent Sarah Mitchell stood in the front yard of a modest two-story colonial house at 99 Tara Drive in Montclair, New Jersey, watching as forensic technicians carried sealed evidence boxes from the residence. The house, painted beige with white trim and surrounded by well-maintained azalea bushes, looked identical to dozens of other homes in this affluent suburb 20 miles west of Manhattan. A basketball hoop hung above the garage door. A garden gnome sat beside the front steps. Children's bicycles leaned against the side of the house. Mitchell, 41 years old, had been with the FBI's Counterintelligence Division for 14 years. The operation that had brought her to this house in Montclair had consumed 5 years of her life and involved hundreds of agents working across multiple states. The investigation, codenamed Operation Ghost Stories, represented one of the FBI's most intensive counterintelligence efforts since the end of the Cold War. The residents of 99 Tara Drive were Richard and Cynthia Murphy. Richard, 61 years old, worked as a tax accountant. Cynthia, 58, had until recently worked part-time at a financial consulting firm in Manhattan. They had purchased the house in 2000 and had lived there for a decade, becoming integrated into the community. They attended neighborhood block parties, hosted 4th of July barbecues, and were members of the local homeowners association. They had 2 daughters who had grown up in the house and were now attending college, one at Columbia University, the other at Duke. What their neighbors, their colleagues, and their daughters did not know was that Richard and Cynthia Murphy were not their real names. The people living at 99 Tara Drive were, according to FBI evidence accumulated over years of surveillance, Russian intelligence officers named Vladimir and Lydia Guriev. They had been sent to the United States in the mid-1990s as part of a program operated by the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, successor to the KGB's First Chief Directorate. Their mission was to establish convincing American identities, blend into American society, and over time develop relationships with individuals who had access to sensitive information about U.S. policy, particularly regarding nuclear weapons, arms control, and relations with Russia. They were, in the parlance of intelligence professionals, illegals, a term that refers not to legal status in the conventional sense, but to operatives who work without diplomatic cover and without official connection to their country's government. Unlike intelligence officers who operate from embassies or consulates and enjoy diplomatic immunity, illegals have no safety net. If caught, they cannot claim diplomatic protection. They face arrest, prosecution, and potentially decades in prison. The program that deployed the Murphys and others like them had its origins in the Soviet era. During the Cold War, the KGB had maintained an extensive Quote One program, training intelligence officers to live abroad under deep cover for years or even decades. The training for such assignments was extensive. According to defectors and declassified materials, KGB illegals underwent years of preparation before deployment. They studied the language, culture, history, and mannerisms of their target country with obsessive attention to detail. They memorized biographies of the identities they would assume, often based on real people who had died young, whose identities could be appropriated with minimal risk of discovery. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Western intelligence agencies initially assumed that Russia's illegals program would be scaled back or eliminated, but the program did not end. Under Vladimir Putin, who became director of the FSB in 1998 and then prime minister in 1999 before ascending to the presidency in 2000, Russian intelligence services experienced a revival. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the SVR had resumed deploying illegals to the United States and other Western countries. The FBI's awareness that this program had resumed came gradually through a combination of signals intelligence, defector information, and surveillance operations. The National Security Agency, monitoring Russian communications, had detected encrypted transmissions that appeared to involve covert communications between SVR headquarters and operatives in the United States. In 2001, a former Russian intelligence officer who had defected to the West provided information to U.S. authorities suggesting that multiple illegals had been deployed to the United States in the previous decade. This information triggered a more intensive effort to identify and locate the suspected illegals. The FBI established a task force within its counterintelligence division and assigned it a code name, Operation Ghost Stories. The first breakthrough came in 2004, when NSA analysts identified a pattern of encrypted shortwave radio transmissions that appeared to be directed to locations in the northeastern United States. By analyzing the timing and frequency of the broadcasts and correlating them with signals intelligence, FBI technical specialists were able to narrow the possible location of the recipient to the New York metropolitan area. In late 2004, FBI surveillance teams began monitoring several addresses in northern New Jersey that had been identified as possible locations for illegals based on a combination of signals, intelligence, and analysis of biographical anomalies. Individuals whose documented life histories showed small inconsistencies that might indicate fabricated identities. One of these addresses was 99 Tara Drive in Montclair. Closer examination of Richard and Cynthia Murphy revealed small anomalies. Richard Murphy's social security number had been issued in 1970, when he would have been 21 years old, later than typical for someone born in 1949. His employment history prior to 1995 was sparse and difficult to verify. Cynthia Murphy's educational records showed she had attended a college in California in the early 1970s, but the college had no record of her attendance when FBI agents made discreet inquiries. These anomalies were not conclusive evidence of anything, but they were enough to warrant surveillance. The surveillance of the Murphys began in earnest in January 2005. FBI agents, working in rotating teams, documented the couple's movements, photographed everyone they met with, recorded their telephone conversations under warrant, and monitored their computer use. What emerged over months of observation was a picture of seemingly ordinary suburban life, combined with small but telling details that suggested covert intelligence activity. Several times each year, both Richard and Cynthia would travel to locations outside New York, where they would meet briefly with individuals who were later identified as known or suspected Russian intelligence officers. These meetings typically lasted only a few minutes and appeared designed to look like chance encounters, but the frequency and pattern suggested they were prearranged. In June 2005, FBI agents observed Richard Murphy meeting with a man in a coffee shop in Lower Manhattan. The two men sat at adjacent tables but did not appear to speak to each other. After approximately 20 minutes, both men left, each carrying what appeared to be identical laptop bags. Subsequent analysis suggested they had exchanged bags, a classic technique for passing information or materials without appearing to have any contact. The FBI's technical teams also detected that the Murphys' computers were being used to receive encrypted messages. Analysis of their wireless network traffic showed periodic bursts of data that appeared to be downloaded from external sources and then immediately encrypted and stored. The FBI obtained a warrant to install monitoring software on the Murphys' computers, allowing agents to see what files they were accessing and creating. What the monitoring revealed was extensive use of steganography, the practice of hiding encrypted data inside seemingly innocent image files. The Murphys would download what appeared to be ordinary photographs and then use special software to extract hidden encrypted messages embedded in the images. These messages appeared to be instructions from their SVR handlers. The FBI also documented that the Murphys were using Quote 2. Receiving encrypted messages via shortwave radio broadcasts. Agents observed Richard Murphy on multiple occasions sitting in the couple's home office late at night with a shortwave radio, transcribing sequences of numbers broadcast on specific frequencies. These numbers were then entered into encryption software on his computer, which decoded them into readable messages in Russian. By late 2005, the FBI had accumulated substantial evidence that Richard and Cynthia Murphy were Russian intelligence officers, but the investigation had also revealed something unexpected. The Murphys were not alone. Over the next 4 years, from 2006 to 2010, the FBI identified and placed under surveillance 10 Russian operatives living in American suburbs under fabricated identities: Donald Howard Heathfield and Tracy Leanne Foley, who lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, near Harvard University. Heathfield claimed to be a business consultant and had attended Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. According to FBI evidence, their real names were Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova, and they were Russian citizens who had assumed the identities of dead Canadian children in the 1990s, Michael Zotoli and Patricia Mills, who lived in Arlington, Virginia. According to FBI investigation, their real names were Mikhail Kutzik and Natalia Pereverzeva. Deployed to the United States in the early 2000s, Juan Lazaro and Vicky Pelaez, who lived in Yonkers, New York. According to the FBI, Lazaro's real name was Mikhail Vasenkov, though Pelaez appeared to be using her real identity and may not have known her husband was an intelligence officer. Anna Chapman, who lived in Manhattan and operated as a real estate entrepreneur. Chapman, whose real name was Anna Kushchenko, was 28 years old and appeared to serve primarily as a courier, facilitating communications between illegals and Russian officials in New York. Mikhail Semenko, who lived in Arlington, Virginia, and worked in travel services. The scope of the operation became clearer as surveillance expanded. The illegals were not engaged in traditional espionage in the sense of stealing classified documents or recruiting government officials with security clearances. Instead, their mission appeared to be long-term relationship building and information gathering. Donald Heathfield had attended Harvard's Kennedy School and had developed relationships with individuals who worked in government or think tanks focused on national security policy. Cynthia Murphy had cultivated relationships with individuals in the financial sector, including at least one person who had access to information about U.S. economic policy discussions. The illegals were gathering what intelligence professionals call _3 information combined with insights from conversations and relationships. They were learning about American attitudes, policy debates, economic trends, and political dynamics, trying to understand not what specific policies the U.S. government would adopt, but how American decision-makers thought, what influenced them, and what their concerns and priorities were. The FBI's decision about how to handle the investigation was complicated by several factors. First, the illegals had not, as far as the FBI could determine, actually obtained any classified information. Second, allowing the operation to continue provided valuable intelligence about how Russian intelligence services operated. Third, the FBI wanted to understand the full scope of the network before taking action. These considerations led the FBI to continue the surveillance operation for years, documenting the illegals' activities, intercepting their communications, and building a comprehensive picture of the network. Life for the operatives and their families during this period appeared entirely normal on the surface. The Murphy daughters attended high school and then went off to college. Neighbors saw the family washing their car, raking leaves, shoveling snow from their driveway. Donald Heathfield and Tracy Foley had two sons who grew up in Massachusetts, attending local schools and participating in sports and extracurricular activities. What none of them appeared to know was that every aspect of their lives was being documented by the FBI. Their telephone calls were monitored, their computers were penetrated, their meetings were observed. FBI agents knew where they went, who they spoke with, what they purchased. The illegals believed they were operating undetected, carefully maintaining their cover identities while fulfilling their intelligence missions. Sarah Mitchell had spent 5 years working the Ghost Stories investigation. She had watched footage of the Murphy family hundreds of times. She had listened to thousands of hours of phone conversations. She had documented Cynthia Murphy's meetings with potential sources and Richard Murphy's dead drop operations. In later interviews, after the case had been declassified, she reflected on the cognitive dissonance of watching people live double lives. She recalled, the impact on the illegals' families, particularly their children, was something FBI agents tried not to think about too much during the investigation. The Murphy daughters, for example, were by all appearances ordinary American teenagers and then young adults. They had grown up in New Jersey, attended public schools, made friends, dated, applied to colleges, and moved away to begin their own lives. According to the FBI's assessment, they appeared to have no knowledge of their parents' real identities or activities. The question of what to do about these children when arrests eventually occurred was discussed extensively within the FBI and the Justice Department. The children were American citizens by birth, born in the United States to people they believed were their parents. But those parents were actually Russian nationals using fabricated identities. What would happen to these children when their parents were arrested? How would they cope with learning that their entire lives had been built on lies? These questions would become even more pressing as the investigation moved toward its conclusion. By early 2010, the FBI had been surveilling the Russian illegals network for more than 5 years. But 2 developments in the spring of 2010 forced the FBI to accelerate its timeline for arrests. First, in April 2010, the FBI learned through signals intelligence that SVR headquarters was planning to recall at least some of the illegals back to Russia in the near future. If the illegals left the United States, the opportunity to arrest them would be lost. Second, in May 2010, FBI surveillance documented what appeared to be preparations for a significant intelligence handoff. Cynthia Murphy had been observed meeting multiple times with a specific individual who worked in a position that gave him access to information about U.S. government policy regarding Russia. The decision was made at the highest levels of the FBI and the Justice Department to move forward with arrests. On June 27, 2010, the FBI executed a synchronized takedown, coordinated arrests of multiple suspects across several states, all occurring within a narrow time frame to prevent any of the suspects from being warned and attempting to flee. At 3 p.m. that day, FBI arrest teams moved simultaneously in New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Virginia. Richard and Cynthia Murphy were arrested at their home in Montclair. According to FBI reports, both remained calm and invoked their right to legal representation without answering questions. Agents searched the house, removing multiple computers, documents, encrypted radios, and other materials as evidence. The Murphy daughters were not at the house when the arrests occurred. Both were at college. They were contacted by FBI agents later that day and informed that their parents had been arrested in connection with espionage activities. According to later accounts, both daughters were bewildered and insisted there must be some mistake. A search of the Murphy residence, conducted under warrant, produced significant evidence: a camera designed for photographing documents, several rolls of microfilm, a code book written in cipher, $7,300 in cash hidden in a locked box in the garage, and handwritten notes that appeared to be translations from Russian. The initial court proceedings occurred rapidly. On June 28, 2010, the day after the arrests, the 10 defendants were arraigned in federal courts in New York and Virginia. The charges included conspiracy to act as unregistered agents of a foreign government, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and in some cases, attempted espionage. The criminal complaint filed by the Justice Department laid out the FBI's evidence in detail: the years of surveillance, the intercepted communications, the observed meetings, the dead drops, the encrypted messages, the false identities. One of the most dramatic moments came when federal prosecutors revealed the true identities of the defendants. Richard and Cynthia Murphy were actually Vladimir and Lydia Guriev, Russian nationals who had assumed the identities of dead Canadians in the 1990s. Donald Heathfield and Tracy Foley were Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova, also using identities appropriated from dead Canadians. The revelation sent shockwaves through the communities where they had lived. In Montclair, neighbors of the Murphys expressed disbelief. Quote, 7-1 neighbor told reporters, quote, 8. For the families of the illegals, particularly their children, the situation was devastating. The Murphy daughters learned that their parents were not Richard and Cynthia Murphy, not even Americans, but Russian intelligence officers who had been living under false identities for more than 15 years. Their entire family history was a fabrication. The sons of Donald Heathfield and Tracy Foley faced similar revelations. They learned that their parents were Andrei Bezrukov and Elena Vavilova, that they had been born not in Canada as they had been told, but in Russia, that their entire family narrative was constructed deception. The legal proceedings moved with unusual speed. Driven by diplomatic considerations, the arrests had created a significant international incident. Within days, discussions began about the possibility of a prisoner exchange. The Russian government indicated willingness to exchange individuals imprisoned in Russia on espionage charges for the arrested illegals. On July 8, 2010, less than 2 weeks after the arrests, the 10 Russian illegals pleaded guilty to conspiracy to act as unregistered agents of a foreign government. The plea agreement called for their deportation to Russia as part of a prisoner exchange. On July 9, 2010, the exchange occurred at an airport in Vienna, Austria. The 10 Russian illegals were flown from the United States to Vienna. where they were exchanged for 4 individuals who had been imprisoned in Russia on charges of spying for the United States. The speed of this resolution meant that many questions about the operation were never fully answered in court. The full scope of what intelligence the illegals had collected, who they had been in contact with, and what damage their activities had caused was never thoroughly examined in public proceedings. But the resolution left significant wreckage in its wake, particularly for the families of the illegals. The children of the arrested operatives faced impossible situations. The Murphy daughters, both American citizens in their late teens and early 20s, had to decide what to do with their lives now that their parents had been deported to Russia. They could remain in the United States, the only country they had ever known, but they would do so knowing their parents were in Russia, living under their real identities as Vladimir and Lydia Guriev. Or they could go to Russia, a country they had never lived in, where they did not speak the language fluently, and where they would be foreigners despite their parents' nationality. In the months following the exchange, several of the children made the painful decision to relocate to Russia to be with their parents. This meant leaving behind the only lives they had known, abandoning educational paths they had begun, and moving to a country that was culturally and linguistically foreign to them. One of the Heathfield Bezrukov sons, who was in his early 20s at the time of his parents' arrest, moved to Moscow after completing his degree in the United States. In an interview he gave several years later to a Russian journalist, he described the experience as profoundly disorienting. Quote 9, he said. Quote 10. He described his relationship with his parents as complicated. He understood intellectually that they had been serving their country, but emotionally, he struggled with the fact that his entire childhood had been a cover story for their intelligence work. Every family vacation, every parent-teacher conference, every birthday celebration, all of it had existed within the framework of their operational cover. Had any of it been real? His parents struggled to answer these questions satisfactorily. They insisted that they had loved him, that their family life had been genuine, even if the identities they were using were not. But they could not escape the fact that they had made choices that prioritized their intelligence mission over other considerations. The Murphy daughters faced similar struggles. One of them eventually moved to Russia to be with her parents, while the other chose to remain in the United States. In a brief interview given to a researcher years later, the daughter who remained in the United States described feeling caught between two identities. Quote, 11, she said. Quote, 12. She described the experience of learning about her parents' true identities as traumatic, and said it had required years of therapy to process. She had struggled with depression, with questions about her own identity, and with a sense of betrayal. She had chosen to keep her distance from her parents, seeing them only occasionally, because maintaining close contact meant constantly confronting the deceptions that had shaped her childhood. A psychologist who worked with some of the children described their situation as a form of identity trauma. They had to reconstruct their understanding of who they were. The psychologist explained in an academic paper published several years after the case. Everything they believed about their family history was false. Their parents were not who they said they were. The stories they were told about where they came from were fabricated. That kind of fundamental deception creates a psychological injury that takes years to heal, if it heals at all. In Russia, the returned illegals were received as heroes. Vladimir Putin, who had been prime minister during their arrest and would return to the presidency in 2012, personally welcomed them back and praised their service. They were awarded medals and honors. Andrei Bezrukov was given a position teaching at an elite Russian academy for intelligence officers. Anna Chapman became a media personality and was featured prominently in Russian press as an example of Russian intelligence capability. The Russian government's treatment of the returned illegals sent a clear message. Despite the arrests, despite the exposure of the operation, Russia valued the work these officers had done. But this hero's welcome came at a cost that the Russian government did not publicly acknowledge. The families of the illegals had been shattered, children had been traumatized, lives built over decades had been destroyed. Vladimir Guriev, Richard Murphy, gave few interviews after returning to Russia, but in one conversation with a Russian journalist in 2015, he acknowledged that the hardest part of the experience had been seeing what it did to his daughters. "They didn't choose this life," he said. "We chose it, but they had no choice, and now they have to live with the consequences of our choices." When asked whether he regretted the decision to have children while operating under deep cover, knowing that discovery would eventually cause them trauma, he paused for a long time before answering. "Regret is complicated," he finally said. "We believed we were serving our country, and that was important to us. But yes, if I had understood fully what this would do to our children, I might have made different choices." The impact of the Ghost Stories case extended beyond the arrested illegals and their families. The case revealed that Russia's SVR was continuing to operate an active illegals program in the United States, even in the post-Cold War era. This surprised many observers who had assumed that such programs were relics of an earlier age. The revelation led to intensified FBI counterintelligence efforts focused on identifying other potential illegals. The case also sparked debate about the effectiveness of the illegals program. Critics pointed out that despite operating for years under deep cover, the Ghost Stories illegals appeared not to have obtained any classified information of significant value. Defenders of the program within the Russian intelligence community countered that effectiveness should not be measured only by specific intelligence gains. The value of illegals, they argued, was in their ability to provide long-term, contextual understanding of American society and policy debates. The question of whether intelligence services should deploy illegals who have children, or whether illegals under deep cover should be permitted to start families, has been debated within intelligence communities. The presence of children adds to the operational cover. Families appear more settled, more integrated into communities, less suspicious. But it also creates profound ethical problems. The children become, in effect, unwitting participants in intelligence operations. They are used to enhance their parents' cover identities without their knowledge or consent. And when operations are compromised, they become collateral damage. Following the Ghost Stories case, there was internal discussion within Russian intelligence services about the wisdom of allowing illegals to have children. No definitive policy changes appear to have been implemented, but the case highlighted the tension between operational effectiveness and human costs. In 2012, Putin addressed the returned illegals at a ceremony, telling them, "I am proud of you. You lived difficult lives, serving your country under challenging circumstances." He presented them with medals and praised their dedication. But he also said something unexpected. Those who serve in intelligence must understand that their choices affect not only themselves, but those close to them. When officers decide to accept deep cover assignments, they must consider what that means for their families. It was an unusual acknowledgement from a leader who typically emphasized duty and service without qualification. Whether it would lead to policy changes remained uncertain. Sarah Mitchell retired from the FBI in 2016. In professional settings where she was permitted to discuss the case, she described Ghost Stories as one of the most significant but also most ethically complex cases of her career. Intelligence work is messy, she said in one interview. It involves deception, manipulation, and often collateral damage. We try to minimize that damage, but we can't eliminate it. The Ghost Stories case reminded me that every operation affects real people in real ways, and we have an obligation to be thoughtful about that even when we can't avoid causing harm. She reflected on the question of whether the illegals program was effective. Did they get classified information? Not that we could document. Did they cause damage to national security? That's harder to answer. They were gathering information, building relationships, providing insights to their government. Was any of it valuable enough to justify the risk and the cost? Intelligence is often about collecting 1,000 small pieces of information that individually seem trivial, but that add up to understanding. Maybe they provided that kind of value. Or maybe the whole operation was more about demonstrating capability than achieving specific intelligence goals. What Mitchell found most troubling was weighing the human cost against whatever intelligence gains the Russians achieved. You have these families destroyed, these children traumatized, these people living under false identities for 15 or 20 years, all for what? So Moscow could get insights into American policy debates? When you weigh the human cost against the intelligence gain, it's hard to see it as worth it. But I also recognize that's not how intelligence services think. They think in terms of capabilities, opportunities, strategic position. The human costs are secondary. The broader implications of the Ghost Stories case extended into questions about identity, nationality, and belonging. The children of the illegals were American by birth, but Russian by parentage, except their parents were using false identities, so even that connection was complicated. After their parents' deportation, where did they belong? Some of the children ultimately chose to maintain dual lives, spending time in both countries, never fully settling in either place. They became people without a clear home, belonging partially to both countries but fully to neither. One of the Bezrukov sons described this when asked a question that most people answer easily. Quote, 25. Quote, 26, he said. Quote, _27_. This loss of simple answers, of clear identity markers, of the ability to take one's own history for granted, became part of the permanent legacy of their parents' choices. They could build lives, develop careers, form relationships, and find ways to move forward, but they would always carry the knowledge that their childhoods were constructed around an intelligence operation. Recovery from this kind of trauma was complicated by the fact that the perpetrators of the deception were also the people the children loved as their parents. Some of the children managed to maintain relationships despite everything. They found ways to separate their parents' roles as intelligence officers from their roles as mothers and fathers. Others could not make that reconciliation. The betrayal felt too comprehensive, the deception too fundamental. Vladimir Guriev, Richard Murphy, died in 2018 at the age of 69, 8 years after his return to Russia. His obituary in Russian media praised his service to his country and noted his years working under deep cover in the United States. One of his daughters attended the funeral in Moscow, traveling from the United States for the occasion. In a brief conversation afterward with a journalist, she declined to discuss her father in detail, but said simply, "He was my father. Whatever else he was my father, and I'm mourning him as a daughter mourns a parent." Lydia Gurieva, Cynthia Murphy, continues to live in Moscow. She has given no public interviews and has maintained a low profile. According to sources familiar with her situation, she maintains contact with both daughters, though the relationships remain strained. Andrei Bezrukov, Donald Heathfield, and Elena Vavilova, Tracy Foley, also continue to live in Russia. Bezrukov has taught at intelligence training facilities and has given occasional public talks about intelligence work, defending the use of illegals as providing unique intelligence value that justifies the operational costs. He has not publicly addressed the personal costs to his family. Anna Chapman has remained in the public eye, working in media and business ventures. She has continued to maintain that her intelligence work was proper service to her country. The case itself has been largely declassified, with extensive documentation released through Freedom of Information Act requests and through voluntary FBI disclosures. This has allowed researchers, journalists, and the public to understand the operational aspects in considerable detail. What remains less well documented are the long-term human consequences, the psychological effects on the children, the dynamics of their relationships with their parents years later, their struggles with identity and belonging. The Ghost Stories case raises fundamental questions about acceptable limits in intelligence operations. Where is the line between acceptable operational methods and methods that cause unacceptable harm to innocent parties? Intelligence services would argue that they operate within legal constraints and that operational decisions weigh risks and benefits. The decision to deploy illegals with families would be defended as an operational necessity that enhances cover and allows for long-term deployments. Critics argue that using families as cover crosses an ethical line because it involves deceiving and ultimately harming people who have no agency in the situation. The children did not consent to be part of intelligence operations, did not choose to grow up in families built around deception, and had no say in decisions that would profoundly affect their lives. This debate involves competing values: national security versus individual rights, operational effectiveness versus ethical constraints, state interests versus human welfare. Intelligence services must operate in ethically complex spaces, and they will inevitably make decisions that harm some people while protecting broader interests. But the Ghost Stories case suggests that intelligence services should be more thoughtful about the human costs of their operations and should actively seek to minimize unnecessary harm. The presence of children in illegal families created significant ethical complications that could have been avoided through different policies. Whether such policies will be implemented is uncertain. Intelligence agencies are not known for transparency about operational methods, and they typically resist external constraints on their activities. But the case has at least generated discussion within intelligence communities about the ethics of using families as operational cover. The story of the Ghost Stories illegals is ultimately about choices and consequences. The illegals chose to accept deep cover assignments. They chose to create families while operating under false identities. They chose to maintain their cover even when doing so required continuous deception of the people closest to them. These were choices made by adults who understood, or should have understood, the potential consequences. But the story is also about consequences that fell on people who made no choices. The children bore consequences they did not choose and did not deserve. They grew up in deception, were traumatized by discovery, and will spend their lives navigating identity questions and relationship complications that resulted from their parents' decisions. The Bezrukov son, who described feeling neither American nor Russian, the Murphy daughter who limits contact with her parents out of self-preservation, the other children who have struggled to rebuild their sense of who they are all living with consequences of choices other people made. They are collateral damage in an intelligence operation that was designed without adequate consideration of what would happen to them when the operation inevitably collapsed. The Ghost Stories illegals served their country as they understood their duty. They accepted risks, endured hardships, and fulfilled their assignments. But they also built families on lies, deceived people who loved them, and created situations that would inevitably cause profound harm when the truth emerged. Richard Murphy was 51 when he and his wife arrived in the United States to begin their deep cover mission. He was 61 when he was arrested. He was 69 when he died. In the years between, he served his country, raised daughters who believed he was someone he was not, and ultimately faced the consequences of those choices. His daughters are still facing those consequences, navigating lives shaped by decisions their father made before they were born. The photograph of Richard Murphy being taken into custody on June 27, 2010, shows an ordinary-looking man in early old age wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt. He looks like any suburban father, which, in some sense, he was. But he was also Vladimir Guriev, a Russian intelligence officer who had been living a lie for 15 years. The photograph captures both identities simultaneously, and neither one is complete without the other. The children of the ghost stories' illegals will spend their lives working through these contradictions, trying to understand how their parents could have been both loving parents and intelligence officers operating under deep cover. Trying to reconcile genuine emotional bonds with fundamental deception. There are no easy answers to these questions, no simple ways to resolve the contradictions. All they can do is continue living, carrying the weight of their unusual family histories, making their own choices about how to move forward. And that burden, the weight of living with consequences of others' choices, the challenge of building identity from fragments of truth and lies, the need to forge relationships with parents who were simultaneously genuine and deceptive, is the real human cost of the ghost stories operation. It cannot be quantified in operational reports or damage assessments, but it is real, it is lasting, and it affects people who deserved better than to be caught in the machinery of intelligence operations they knew nothing about.